Stand at the edge of a cornfield in the middle of July, and the first thing that strikes you is the silence. Not real silence. There is wind and the dry papery rustle of leaves brushing against each other, and somewhere a tractor 2 fields over. But it feels like silence because nothing appears to be happening. 10,000 plants standing in perfect rows, all the same height, all the same green, all completely still except for the wind moving through them. It looks like the most passive thing in the world. A crowd of green statues waiting for the sun. And that is the single biggest misunderstanding people have about corn. Because at this exact moment, inside every one of those stalks, something is happening that would take a supercomputer to model properly. Water is being lifted 20 feet into the air without a pump. Sugar is being manufactured out of thin air, literally, out of air, at a rate that would embarrass most factories. Chemical messages are traveling from the roots to the leaves and back again. Cells are dividing on a schedule so precise you could almost set a clock by them. And somewhere deep in the plant's tissue, a decision is being made about how many kernels this plant will produce this year. A decision the farmer will not find out about for another 2 months. The corn is not standing still. The corn is working harder than anything else in that field, including the farmer. And to understand what it's doing, we have to go inside, not with a shovel, with something much smaller. Let's start where the corn plant started. Underground in the dark. Picture a single seed, dropped into soil 2 inches deep by a planter moving across the field at 5 miles an hour. It's about the size of your fingernail, hard, dry, wrinkled, and yellow. If you held it in your palm, you would not think much of it. It looks less alive than a pebble. But this seed is not asleep, it's paused. Inside that hard yellow shell is a tiny, fully formed baby plant. Not a blueprint for a plant, an actual plant, with the beginnings of a root, the beginnings of a shoot, and the first few leaves already folded up like origami inside a package smaller than a grain of rice. Scientists call this the embryo. It was made months ago, on a different plant in a different field, and it has been holding its breath ever since. And packed all around that embryo is the reason corn feeds the world, the endosperm. That's the starchy white part that makes up most of the kernel. It's a lunchbox, a survival kit, concentrated food, sealed and stored, waiting to be spent. But it will only be spent once. There is no second lunchbox. Whatever this seed does with that energy, it has to work, because after that, the plant is on its own. So what wakes it up? Water. Not sunlight. The seed is buried, it can't see sunlight. Not warmth alone. Water. When soil moisture reaches the seed begins to absorb it, and it absorbs it aggressively, swelling to nearly a third bigger than its dry size. And that swelling is not gentle. The pressure inside that kernel becomes enormous, enough to physically split the seed coat open from the inside. Now the clock has started, and it cannot be stopped. Because here's the part that makes farmers nervous, and most people never think about. Once a seed takes on water, it has committed. It has spent energy. It cannot dry back out and try again next week. If the weather turns cold now, if the soil crusts over, if it rains too hard and the ground seals into a lid, the seed keeps burning through its lunchbox anyway in the dark, trying to reach a surface it may never reach. This is why farmers stare at 10-day forecasts like they're reading a court verdict. Planting corn is not a chore, it's a bet. And the moment the seed drinks, the bet is locked in. Under a microscope, what happens next looks almost violent. Enzymes flood into the endosperm. Think of enzymes as tiny biological scissors, each one shaped to cut one specific thing. These particular scissors attack starch. Starch, remember, is just sugar molecules chained together into long links, hundreds of them, packed tight for storage. The enzymes go down those chains, snipping the links apart, and suddenly the seed's solid, stable, locked-away food supply becomes something the embryo can actually use. Free sugar, dissolved in water, flowing to wherever it's needed. the seed is eating itself, on purpose, to fund a journey. And the first thing it funds is not the leaf, it's the root. This surprises almost everyone. If you were designing a plant, you'd probably send the shoot up first, get to the sunlight, start making food, then worry about the rest. The corn plant does the opposite. It sends the root down first always, without exception. And once you think about it for 10 seconds, it's obvious why. Sunlight is not going anywhere, water is. The soil around that seed might be moist today and bone dry in 6 days. So the very first move the corn plant makes in its entire life is to secure the resource that can disappear. It anchors itself. It finds water. It builds the supply line before it builds the factory. Every farmer who has ever lost a crop knows the logic in that decision, even if they've never thought about it in those terms. So down goes the radical, the first root pushing through the seed coat, turning downward because it can sense gravity. Actually sense it. Inside the root tip are cells containing tiny dense starch grains that literally sink to the bottom of the cell, like sand settling in a jar. The plant reads which side those grains have settled on, and it knows which way is down. A root in the dark, with no eyes and no brain, using falling sand to navigate. And then the shoot begins to climb. Now, this is where corn does something genuinely clever, and it's a detail almost nobody notices. The shoot pushing up through the soil is not a soft green leaf. If it were, it would be shredded. Soil is not fluffy. Soil is full of sharp mineral grains, compacted clods, sometimes a crust as hard as a cracker. A tender leaf pushing up through, that would tear itself to pieces. So corn sends up a spear instead. It's called the coleoptile, a pale, tough, pointed sheath like a sword sleeve, and folded up safely inside it are the real leaves, the delicate ones, riding up in complete safety while the sheath takes the damage. The coleoptile is a bodyguard. It has one job: get the leaves to the surface alive, then die. And how does it know when to stop? Light. The instant the tip of that spear breaks the soil surface and light hits it, and we're talking about light levels so low you'd barely call it dawn, the coleoptile stops growing. It stops immediately. It splits open, and the first true leaf slides out into the world. If light never arrives, the coleoptile keeps stretching, burning lunchbox energy, reaching. And this is one of the most heartbreaking things you can find in a field. Dig into a spot where nothing came up and you may find them. Pale, ghostly white spears, twisted and looped underneath a crusted layer of soil, having grown and grown and grown, and finally run out of fuel 3/4 of an inch from the sun. They didn't fail because they were weak. They failed because they were sealed in. But let's say ours makes it. Let's say the light hits, the spear splits, the leaf unfurls, and now, for the first time, a green thing exists where there was only brown. The farmer drives past, looks across the field, and sees the rows appear like a photograph developing. This is what they call emergence, and it is the first time in the entire season that anyone can see what's really going on. Everything up to this point happened in the dark, invisible, unverifiable. Now the field tells the truth. And the plant, at this moment, is in the most dangerous position of its life. Because it is now completely broke. Think about it. The lunchbox is nearly empty. Every bit of stored starch has been spent on the root and that spear. The plant has no reserves left, no savings, nothing. And it has exactly one asset in the world, one small green leaf. That leaf has to start paying for everything, immediately, or it's over. So what does a leaf actually do? We say plants make food from sunlight, and we say it so casually, so often, that it has stopped sounding like anything. It sounds like a fact from a school poster, but slow down and look at what is actually being claimed here, because it is genuinely one of the strangest things in nature. A corn plant is mostly made of carbon. Its stalk, its leaves, its roots, the cob, the kernels, carbon, hooked together into structures. So where did all that carbon come from? not the soil. This is the thing people get wrong almost universally. If you weigh the soil in a pot before and after growing a plant in it, the soil barely loses any weight at all. The plant did not eat the ground. The corn plant is built out of air. The carbon in a corn stalk was, not long ago, carbon dioxide gas, drifting invisibly past your face. The plant pulled it out of the atmosphere, one molecule at a time, and welded it into solid matter. A 10-foot stalk you can lean your weight against, built from something you can't even see. And it does this with a chemical that is, frankly, not very good at its job. There's an enzyme inside every leaf called Rubisco. It is the single most abundant protein on planet Earth. There is more Rubisco than any other protein in existence, by mass, and there always has been. Its job is to grab a carbon dioxide molecule out of the air and attach it to a waiting molecule inside the leaf. That's the first handshake. That's the moment air becomes life. The problem is that Rubisco is sloppy. It is supposed to grab carbon dioxide, but it also, quite often, grabs oxygen by mistake, because oxygen and carbon dioxide are similar enough in size and shape that Rubisco can't reliably tell them apart. And when it grabs oxygen, the whole reaction goes backwards. Instead of building sugar, the plant wastes energy cleaning up a mistake. Scientists call this photorespiration. You could call it the plant tripping over its own feet. Now here's the cruel part. The hotter it gets and the brighter the sun, the more often Rubisco makes this mistake. Which means the exact conditions that should be perfect for growth, a blazing hot, brilliantly sunny July day, are conditions in which most plants get less efficient. They're standing in a flood of free energy and fumbling it. This is a real problem. This is the reason a huge amount of the plant world does badly in hot climates. Corn does not have this problem. And the reason why is one of the great pieces of engineering in the natural world, and it's happening, right now, inside every leaf in that field. Take a corn leaf and slice it thinner than paper, thin enough for light to pass through, and put it under a microscope. What you see doesn't look random, it looks designed. Around each vein in the leaf, there is a ring of large, tightly packed cells, a wreath, and around that wreath, a second ring of different cells. 2 rings, 2 teams, 2 completely separate jobs. The outer cells do the catching. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air using a different enzyme, one that, unlike Rubisco, never gets confused, never grabs oxygen by mistake and works fast. It snatches the carbon, locks it into a 4-carbon compound, and then hands that compound inward to the ring of cells around the vein. And inside that inner ring, sealed off from the outside air, the compound is broken open and the carbon dioxide is released. Do you see what just happened? The corn plant built a room, a pressure chamber. Inside those inner cells, the carbon dioxide concentration is pumped up far higher than the air outside, so high that Rubisco, sitting in there, is practically drowning in carbon dioxide. It's surrounded. It cannot make a mistake, because there's almost no oxygen nearby to grab, and there's carbon dioxide everywhere it turns. Corn takes an unreliable worker and puts it in a room where the only possible thing to grab is the right thing. This is called C4 photosynthesis, named for that 4-carbon compound, and only a small minority of plant species on Earth do it. Corn is one. Sugar cane is one. Sorghum. Most other crops, wheat, rice, soybeans, are not. It costs extra energy to run this system. It's a pump, and pumps need power, which means in cool, dim, gentle conditions, this whole apparatus is overkill and corn has no real advantage. But in heat, in brutal, relentless midsummer sun, corn doesn't just cope, corn accelerates. And now you understand something about the world that you can't unsee. Look at where corn is grown at scale. Iowa, Nebraska, the Punjab, northern China, Brazil. The hot places, the summer places, the places where the sun is a hammer. That is not a coincidence, and it's not tradition, and it's not just soil. It is chemistry. Corn was built for exactly the conditions that make other plants stumble. And there's always a but, and this one is enormous. That entire system depends on one thing. The plant has to let air in. Carbon dioxide is outside. The machinery is inside. And in between is a waterproof waxy skin, because a leaf that couldn't hold water in would shrivel in an afternoon. So the air has to come in through doors. Turn the leaf over. Under a microscope you'll see them, and once you've seen them you'll never think of a leaf the same way again. Thousands upon thousands of tiny mouths, arranged in neat rows, each one made of two curved cells facing each other like lips. They're called stomata. Every single one can open and close independently. And here is the deal the corn plant is forced to make, every hour of every day, for its entire life. To let carbon dioxide in, it must open the doors. But the moment the doors open, water gets out. Water that took enormous effort to pull up from the roots, 20 feet against gravity, is released as invisible vapor into the air. And on a hot, dry day with wind, it doesn't drift out, it's ripped out. The numbers are difficult to believe. To build 1 single gram of dry plant matter, that's about the weight of a paperclip. A corn plant will typically transpire somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 grams of water. 200 times its reward, spent as the price of admission. Scale that up. A mature cornfield in the peak of summer can move thousands of liters of water per acre per day, up out of the ground, through millions of microscopic doors into the sky. A cornfield is not really a field. It's a fountain pointing upward, invisible. Now think about what this means for the plant on a scorching afternoon. The sun is at maximum. The C4 machinery is primed and ready. This is the plant's best hour, the conditions it was built for. But it's 38 degrees, the wind is dry, and water is being torn out of every open door faster than the roots can possibly replace it. The plant has to choose. Keep the doors open, keep making sugar, and risk drying out from the inside. Or shut the doors, save the water, and stop growing entirely. And it chooses. It actually makes this decision thousands of times over across every leaf in real time. The roots send up a chemical signal when soil water gets scarce, a hormone message that essentially says, "It's dry down here." That signal reaches the guard cells around each stoma, and the guard cells release the pressure holding them apart and the lips close. The plant, in effect, is reading a report from its own supply department and shutting the factory floor. You can watch it happen without any equipment at all if you know what to look for. Walk into a cornfield at 2 in the afternoon in a dry August. The leaves won't be flat and open. They'll be rolled, curled inward along their length into narrow tubes like closed umbrellas. Every leaf in every row as far as you can see. Farmers call it firing or rolling, and it's not decoration. The plant is reducing the surface area exposed to sun and wind, tucking its stomata inside a sheltered tube where the humid air can't escape so easily. It's a defensive crouch. And when you see a whole field rolled at midday, you are looking at 100,000 plants that have all independently decided that survival is worth more than growth today. They will unroll in the evening. They almost always do. But something has been lost. Those hours of shut doors were hours of no sugar production, on a day of perfect sunlight, a payday missed. And the plant is on a schedule that does not care about excuses. Because there's something coming, something that has been growing invisibly inside that stalk since the plant was barely knee-high, a hidden structure that has already been silently deciding this plant's entire future. And by the time the farmer can see it, the decision is already made. Let's go find it. Look at a corn plant in early June. It's maybe thigh-high. It looks like a big grass. There's no cob, no tassel, no sign of a single kernel anywhere. If you asked most people what this plant is doing, they'd say, growing leaves, getting bigger, getting ready. But that's not what it's doing. Slice that stalk open lengthwise carefully with a sharp blade, and near the base, hidden inside a nest of tightly wrapped leaf bases, you will find something the size of a pencil eraser. Pale, soft, almost invisible unless you know it's there. That is the growing point, the command center. And here's the strange fact. For the first several weeks of a corn plant's life, that growing point is not up in the top of the plant where you'd expect. It's down near the ground, sometimes even below the soil surface. Which, by the way, is why a young corn plant can survive things that should kill it. Hail can shred every leaf to green confetti. A late frost can turn the top of the plant black. And the plant just regrows because you didn't hit the brain. The brain was underground the whole time, wrapped in armor waiting. But inside that pencil eraser is where the real work is happening. Because that structure is not just making leaves, it is counting them. It is deciding in advance exactly how many leaves this plant will ever produce in its entire life. The total is being set right now, weeks before those leaves exist. And more than that. Somewhere in the middle of that process, the plant makes a commitment it can never take back. It decides how many rows of kernels the cob will have. Not later, not when the cob appears. Now, while the plant is knee-high and the farmer is thinking about something else entirely. The rows of kernels you will one day see on a corn cob were determined weeks before there was a cob, by a structure smaller than your fingernail, based on conditions that day. Was the plant stressed that week? Cold soil, too wet, crowded by neighbors, short on nitrogen. Then the number is lower, permanently, forever. You cannot fix it in July. You cannot fertilize it back. You cannot pray it back. That number was written in June, in the dark, inside the stem, and the plant will spend the rest of the season honoring a contract it signed before anyone was watching. And the second number, how many kernels along each row, the length of the cob, that one gets decided a few weeks later, and it is even more brutal. But to understand why, we have to look at what happens when the corn plant does the strangest thing it does all year. It splits itself in two. There's a word farmers use, and it sounds so mild you'd never guess what it describes. Tibak. It sounds like nothing, a technical term, a minor cosmetic thing. Pull an ear of corn out of a field in a hard year, strip the husk off and turn it in your hands. The base is beautiful, full, plump, perfect kernels packed in tight rows, glossy yellow, exactly what corn is supposed to look like. Halfway up, still good. 3/4 of the way up, still good. And then at the tip, it just stops. The last inch is bare. A pale, naked spindle of cob with nothing on it. Sometimes just a scattering of shriveled little half-formed things that look like they started and gave up, and then nothing at all. That's tip back, and it's not damage, nothing attacked that ear. No insect, no disease, no hail. The plant killed them. Deliberately, systematically, starting from the tip and working backward, one kernel at a time, in a specific order on purpose. Let me show you how that decision gets made, because it is the coldest, clearest piece of arithmetic in this entire story. Go back a couple of weeks. Pollination has just finished. 800 silks caught pollen, 800 tubes traveled, 800 double fertilizations succeeded. 800 kernels are now alive on that cob, each one a genuine embryo with a genuine food store starting to form around it. Every one of them is now a mouth. And every one of them is now sending chemical signals down into the cob, essentially saying the same thing, feed me. Each developing kernel is pulling for sugar. Each one is a demand on the plant's account. And the plant's account has exactly one source of income, the leaves. That's it. That's the whole economy. Whatever the leaves produce this week is what there is to spend this week. There is no reserve, no loan, no emergency fund, nothing except a modest amount of sugar stored in the stalk, and we'll come back to that, because the plant is going to burn it in a way that should genuinely disturb you. So now imagine a good year. Rain came at the right time. The soil is moist. Stomata are open all day, every day, the C4 machinery running at full speed under a hot sun, exactly the conditions corn was built for. Sugar is pouring down the stalk toward the cob in a flood. 800 mouths, and there's enough for 800. Everybody eats, everybody fills, and you get the ear you see in a photograph, kernels running right to the very tip, wrapped around the end, no gap at all. Farmers see that and they smile, because that ear is a report card, and it says the plant was never once in trouble. Now imagine August turns dry. The soil moisture drops. The roots send up the signal. The stomata close at 10 in the morning and stay shut until evening. The leaves roll into tubes. And the sugar coming down that stalk slows to a trickle. 800 mouths, food for 500. What does the plant do? Here's what it does not do, and this is the part that took me a long time to properly appreciate. It does not share. It does not divide the sugar evenly among all 800 and give everybody a little. That would be the kind thing. It would also be suicide, because 800 half-fed kernels means 800 shriveled, weak, underweight seeds, none of them with enough stored starch to power a root and a spear through 2 inches of soil next spring. The plant would have 800 children and all of them would die in the dark, 3/4 of an inch from the sun. So the plant does the other thing. It picks 300 and cuts them off. Not randomly. There's an order, and the order is geographic. The kernels at the tip of the ear are the furthest from the stalk, the end of the supply line, the last stop on the delivery route. When supply gets tight, they're the ones that come up short first. Their sugar delivery drops below what they need and they stop developing. And once a kernel stops, it doesn't restart. The plant stops investing in it entirely, and it collapses, dries, shrivels, disappears back into the cob. And the moment it dies, its share is released. The sugar that would have gone to it now flows to the kernels behind it, which are, suddenly, fully funded again. Do you see the mechanism? The plant kills from the tip backward, until the number of remaining kernels matches the amount of food it can actually deliver. It is triage. It is a lifeboat with a hard capacity limit and a captain who can count. And the worse the year, the further back the killing goes. A mild drought takes half an inch. A serious one takes 2. In a truly brutal year, the plant will strip an ear back until there's almost nothing left, a handful of kernels clustered down at the base, and 4 inches of bare white spindle above them. But here's the thing, those survivors, they're perfect, full size, full weight, completely viable, absolutely capable of germinating next spring and starting this whole story over. The plant didn't produce a poor crop. The plant produced a smaller, complete crop, and it produced it by making a decision no farmer would ever have the stomach to make manually, and it made it in silence, inside a husk, weeks before anyone could see. And when the farmer walks into that field in September, pulls an ear, peels it back, and sees 3 inches of bare tip, they're not just seeing a disappointing ear. They're reading a weather report from 3 weeks ago. That bare tip is a record. It says, it got dry right about here and it stayed dry for roughly this long. The ear is a document. The plant wrote the history of its own August in the only language it has. You can walk a field and read the whole summer off the cobs. Now I want to sit with one detail, because it's the detail that changes how this feels. There is a window, a short one, maybe 2 or 3 weeks right after pollination, when this culling happens. That's when the plant is doing its arithmetic, when kernel numbers are still negotiable, when a dry spell translates directly into dead kernels. After that window closes, the number is fixed, locked. No more kernels die and no new ones appear. Which means the single most important 2 weeks of a corn plant's entire year, The weeks that determine, more than any other, how much grain comes off that field are 2 weeks in midsummer when the plant looks absolutely magnificent. Tall, dark green, waving, beautiful. The whole thing is decided while everything looks fine. And this is the part farmers carry around with them. You can do everything right, plant on time, feed the crop, control the weeds, spend a fortune. And then the sky decides, in a fortnight you have no control over, how much of it counted. That's not a farming problem. That's just the arrangement. That's the deal you sign when you decide to grow food. But let's be generous. Let's say the rain came. Let's say the ear held its kernels almost to the tip. Now the plant enters the longest, quietest, most single-minded phase of its life. And there is no drama in it at all, which is exactly why almost nobody talks about it. From the outside, the field just stands there for 6 weeks. Inside, it's a factory running at full tilt. Open an ear about 10 days after pollination. Peel back the husk, and the kernels are small, pale, translucent, barely there. Take a fingernail and pop one. Liquid comes out, milky white like a drop of thin cream. Farmers call this the milk stage, and it's an honest name because that is exactly what it looks like. But what you're actually looking at is not milk. It's the endosperm, that second fertilization product, the lunchbox. And at this moment it exists mostly as sugar dissolved in water. It's liquid because it hasn't been packed yet. This is, incidentally, roughly the stage at which we eat sweet corn. Sweet corn is a corn plant caught in the act, interrupted mid-sentence, harvested during the milk stage while the sugar is still sugar, before the plant has had a chance to do what it's about to do. Because what happens next is that the plant starts converting. Sugar is fantastic for transport. It dissolves, it flows, you can move it around a plant easily. But it's terrible for storage. It's bulky, it attracts water, and crucially, anything that finds it can eat it. So inside every kernel, enzymes begin hooking those sugar molecules together into long chains, hundreds of units long, and packing those chains into dense granules. Starch. You remember starch. We met it in the first minutes of this story, in the dry kernel in the soil, being cut apart by enzymes to fund a root and a spear. Watch what just happened. The plant is now doing that operation in reverse. It's building the exact molecule it will one day tear apart. It is packing the lunchbox it will unpack next April. And there's a quiet elegance in it. Starch is unreactive, stable, insoluble. It doesn't attract water, doesn't ferment, doesn't rot easily. It can sit in a dry kernel through a winter, through a year, through, in the right conditions, decades, and still be exactly what it was. Starch is how a summer gets saved. Every grain of it in that kernel is a fragment of a July afternoon, a carbon dioxide molecule that drifted in through a stoma, got caught by the C4 pump, welded into sugar, shipped down the stalk and locked away. A cornfield is a machine for turning sunlight into a shape that can survive the dark. So the kernels thicken. Pop one at 3 weeks and you don't get milk anymore, you get paste, thick, doughy like uncooked bread. That's the dough stage, and the name is again exactly right. And through all of this, look at the plant's silhouette. It hasn't changed at all. Same height, same shape. Since the tassel emerged, the corn plant has not grown a single millimeter taller because it can't. Every leaf it will ever have was counted out in June, and the stalk finished stretching when the tassel arrived. The plant is done growing. It is now only filling. 6 weeks of a field standing perfectly still, looking identical day after day, while inside every ear, dry weight is piling on so fast that a corn crop can put on grain weight at a rate that would double the mass of the ear in a fortnight. The most boring-looking phase of the season is the phase where the actual harvest gets made. And this is when the plant does the thing I find hardest to think about calmly. The leaves are the income, but by late August, the lower leaves are in trouble, shaded out by the canopy above them, aging, less efficient than they were. Meanwhile, the demand from the ear is relentless and rising. So the plant starts taking itself apart. It reaches into its own lower leaves and pulls out the nitrogen. The nitrogen locked up inside the proteins, inside the photosynthesis machinery itself, inside rubisco, the most abundant protein on Earth, sitting right there in the leaf, made of exactly the nutrient the ear is screaming for. The plant dismantles its own factory and ships the parts to the cob. Watch a cornfield through September, and you can see it happening. The bottom leaves go pale, then yellow, then brown and papery, and the yellowing climbs the plant slowly from the ground up. People see that and think the plant is dying of something. It's not dying of anything. It's spending itself. That yellow is the color of a plant liquidating its own assets to fund its children. Every yellow leaf is a leaf that has been stripped and abandoned because the ear needed it more. And if the year is hard, if there's not enough nitrogen in the soil, or a drought throttles the leaves' output, the plant goes further. It starts on the stalk. There's sugar stored in that stalk, laid down in better weeks. The plant pulls it out and sends it to the ear, and then it pulls out more and more, until the stalk is hollowed of reserves, structurally weakened, thin-walled, brittle. And then a wind comes through in October, and the field goes down flat. Farmers call it stalk lodging, and it's one of the worst sights in agriculture. An entire field folded over, ears lying in the mud, half of them impossible to pick up with a combine. A season's work on the ground. But understand what actually happened there. The plant didn't fail. The plant chose. Faced with a decision between staying standing and filling its grain, the corn plant chose the grain every time without hesitation and accepted that it might fall over as a consequence. The plant will trade its own body for its seed. It will trade its own skeleton. Because from the plant's point of view, and this is the thing we forget, standing in a field looking at 10,000 plants we intend to eat, the plant does not care about being harvested. The plant does not care about the combine. The plant has one goal, the same goal it has had since it was a spear in the dark, and it is the goal every living thing on this planet shares. Get the next generation packed, sealed, and viable before the cold comes. Standing up is optional, kernels are not. And eventually, and this is the moment I want to leave you on, before we come back and finish this, the plant decides it's over. Not the frost, not the farmer, the plant. There comes a point, sometime in September, when the kernel has received everything it's going to receive. And at the base of every single kernel where it attaches to the cob, a layer of cells dies, deliberately, on schedule, sealing the join. It's called the black layer, and it's visible, split a mature kernel down the middle, and you'll see a dark line right at the tip where it meets the cob. That layer is a door being closed and locked from the inside. The instant it forms, that kernel is disconnected from the mother plant forever. No more sugar can enter. Nothing more can be added or taken away. Whatever's in there is what's in there. The plant, kernel by kernel, cuts the cord. And the strangest part, after that moment the plant could stand in perfect weather, with full sun and endless water, for another month, and not 1 gram would be added to that grain. The connection is gone. The transaction is closed. The plant has finished. Everything after this is just waiting. But we're not finished. Because there's one thing left that the plant still has to do, one last quiet act that nobody photographs, nobody celebrates, and without which every single thing we have just watched would have been for nothing. The plant has to dry. Water made this plant. Think about that for a second, because we've watched it happen. Water woke the seed and split it open. Water was the reason the root went down before the shoot went up. Water was what got torn out of 100,000 open doors on every hot afternoon, 200 grams of it spent for every gram of plant built. Water was what the silks needed to reach the air in time, and water, or the lack of it, was what killed 300 kernels at the tip of the ear in August. Every single crisis in this story was a water story. And now, at the very end, the plant turns around and does the one thing you would never predict. It gets rid of it. The plant that fought for water its entire life now stands in a field in October and deliberately, systematically dries itself out. It doesn't wilt. It doesn't die of thirst. It evacuates. And it does this on purpose because the last act of a corn plant's life is not growing anything. It's preservation. Here's why it has no choice. At the moment that black layer forms and the kernel is sealed off, that kernel is somewhere around 30% water. It is a living, breathing, metabolically active thing. It's respiring, slowly burning its own starch, quietly, the way any living tissue does, just to stay alive. And that's a problem, because everything the plant built into that kernel, the entire lunchbox, every granule of starch, every fragment of a July afternoon, is now a fixed quantity. Nothing more can enter. The door is locked. So every day that kernel sits there breathing, it is spending its own inheritance. Slowly, molecule by molecule, burning the food it will need next spring, for no reason at all, just to keep the lights on through a winter it hasn't even reached yet. And it's not the only thing that wants that starch. Because the moment that kernel exists, it becomes the single most attractive object in the landscape. It is a dense, concentrated, ready-to-eat package of pure energy, and there is nothing in the natural world that will not take it. Fungi want it. Bacteria want it. Insects want it. Mice, birds, deer, everything with a mouth. The kernel has no shell to speak of, no poison, no thorns. It has no defense whatsoever except one. It gets too dry to be worth attacking. Because here is the physics that quietly governs every granary, every silo, every grain store on Earth, and has done since the first person decided to keep some seed instead of eating it all. Life needs liquid water. Fungal spores can't germinate without moisture. Bacteria can't multiply without it. Enzymes can't function without it. Even the kernel's own respiration slows almost to nothing without it. Take the water away, and you don't kill the enemy. You just make the kernel a place where nothing can live. So the plant drives the moisture down. 30%, 25, 20. The husk loosens, the cob dries, the whole plant turns from green to tan to a pale bleached straw color, and moisture leaves the kernel into the autumn air, day after day, and the field turns the color of paper. And somewhere in the low 20s, the kernel crosses a line. Its metabolism slows to a crawl. The embryo inside, that tiny, fully formed baby plant with its root and its spear and its folded leaves, stops developing and simply waits. It's not dead, it's paused. Which is exactly where we started. Remember, first minutes of this story. A hard yellow kernel that looked less alive than a pebble, holding its breath. Now you know what that pebble actually is. It's the survivor of a summer. It's the winner of a triage decision made at the tip of an ear in a dry August. It carries a food store built by a second fertilization delivered down a tunnel bored through a hair. It contains carbon that was floating in the air above a field in July. And it is dry on purpose, because dryness is the only armor it has. That kernel is not waiting to become something. It already is something. It's a summer folded up in a shape that can survive the dark. And this is where the corn plant's story and our story collide, because that exact property, that a dry seed can wait, is the single fact that human civilization is built on. Think about what a hunter-gatherer's food does. A fish rots, a deer rots, fruit rots. Every calorie you acquire is on a clock, and the clock is short, and so your life is structured entirely around the next acquisition. You cannot plan a year. You cannot build a city. You cannot feed a person who doesn't produce food because there's no surplus that survives long enough to be given away. A dry grain doesn't rot. A dry grain can sit in a jar for a year, 2 years. It can be counted, stored, moved, traded, taxed, saved for a bad season, and handed to someone who spent their day doing something other than finding food, building a wall, making a pot, writing something down. Every civilization on Earth was built on a grain. Wheat in the Middle East, rice in Asia, corn in the Americas. Not because grain is delicious, because grain keeps. And it keeps because the plant at the end of its life chose to dry. The corn plant invented storage. It invented it for its own reasons, tens of thousands of years before anybody was watching, purely to get its children through a winter. And then a group of people in southern Mexico noticed, and the rest of everything followed. Which brings us to the harvest and to a number. Because now the farmer is standing at the edge of the field, and everything comes down to a moisture percentage. Corn is usually ready to be picked somewhere around 25% moisture, but it's usually stored at around 15. And that gap, those 10 points, is where an enormous amount of the economics of modern agriculture actually lives. If you harvest too wet, the grain will spoil in the bin. It'll heat up, mold will bloom through it, and you can lose the entire store. So you dry it artificially with fans, with heat, burning fuel. That costs money, sometimes a lot of it. If you leave it in the field to dry naturally, that's free. The sun and the wind do it for nothing. But every extra week out there is a week the stalks, remember, hollowed out, cannibalized to fill the grain, might snap in a storm and put your whole crop face down in the mud. It's a week for deer and birds and rot. So the farmer waits and watches the forecast and weighs a fuel bill against a wind. That's the last decision of the year, and it's the same shape as every other decision in this story. A trade, not a right answer, a trade. And then the combine goes in. If you've never seen one work up close, it's worth understanding what it's actually doing, because it's less like cutting and more like a very fast, very violent version of what your hands would do. The header at the front doesn't cut the stalk down. Snapping rolls grab each stalk and yank it downward hard, and the ear, too fat to follow, is torn off and thrown back. The rest of the plant, the entire body of it, is pushed to the ground and left behind. Leaves, stalk, roots, all of it. Only the ear goes in. Then inside the machine, the ear is beaten, rubbed against a rotating drum and a concave grate until the kernels are knocked off the cob. Then air and sieves separate them from the debris, and clean, dry, loose kernels stream up into a tank. That machine does in a couple of seconds, per plant, across 12 rows at a time, what would take a person with 2 hands about a minute. It is one of the most consequential machines ever built, and almost nobody who eats has ever seen one. And notice what it leaves behind, because this part matters more than it looks. The stalk, the leaves, the roots, all of it back on the ground. That's not waste. That's the plant's body being returned to the soil that made it. Over the winter, it breaks down insects, fungi, bacteria, taking it apart into carbon and structure that becomes the soil itself. The plant took carbon out of the air, built a body out of it, gave the good part to us, and left the rest as a gift to the ground. The only thing that actually leaves the field in the end is the seed. Everything else goes home. Now I want to close a loop, and it's a loop most people don't even know is open. Where does that corn go? Because I suspect that if you asked most people what happens to the world's corn, they'd picture a plate. Corn on the cob, butter, salt. A summer barbecue. That's a rounding error. The overwhelming majority of the corn grown on this planet is not eaten as corn by anyone. It's fed to animals. It becomes chickens and eggs and milk and beef and pork. Enormous quantities become ethanol for fuel. And of what's left, a lot is broken down industrially into starch and sugars, and turns up in things you would never, ever call corn: sweeteners, thickeners, coatings, the crisp shell on things, the texture in things, glue on envelopes, the filler in tablets. Corn is not a vegetable on the world's plate. Corn is closer to a raw material. It's a way of turning sunlight into carbohydrate at scale, and then turning that carbohydrate into whatever the world happens to want. So when you look at a cornfield, you are not really looking at food. You're looking at a solar farm. 30,000 self-assembling, self-repairing, self-replicating machines per acre that build themselves out of air, run on light, dig their own water supply, defend themselves, make their own decisions about resource allocation, and at the end of the season hand you a dense package of pure chemical energy, and then rebuild the soil with their own bodies on the way out. We didn't design that. We found it. In Mexico, around 9,000 years ago, growing wild as a scrappy little grass with a seed head you could hold between two fingers. A plant so unlike modern corn that when botanists first suggested the connection, other botanists thought they were joking. And then generation after generation of people, none of whom knew a single thing about genetics, none of whom had ever heard of a chromosome, did the only thing they could do. They saved the seed from the best plants and planted it again. Every year. For 9,000 years. That's it, that's the whole technology. Notice what worked, keep it, repeat. And that slow, patient, unglamorous act, done by ordinary people who never got their names recorded anywhere, turned a wild grass into the most productive food crop on the planet. Nobody in that chain saw the result. Every single one of them was working on something they'd never live to see finished, handing it forward to someone they'd never meet. Every kernel of corn on earth is a message from those people. So, let's go back to that field. July, the one from the beginning. You're standing at the edge, 10,000 plants perfectly still doing nothing, green statues in the sun. Except now you know. You know that under your feet, roots are pushing through the dark, navigating with grains of falling starch. You know that above you, in every leaf, an unreliable enzyme is being held in a chemical room where it cannot make a mistake, welding air into sugar in the exact heat that would make other plants fumble. You know that thousands of tiny mouths on the underside of every leaf are opening and closing, over and over, negotiating a deal between growth and thirst, and that the whole field will crouch and roll and give up a day's work if the water runs short. You know that somewhere in the middle of every stalk there's a single chosen ear, and the plant abandoned all the others to fund it. You know the pollen is coming, millions of grains from every tassel, and that underneath, in the dark inside the husk, 800 separate threads are racing to reach the air in time, and that the entire year comes down to whether they make it before the pollen stops. You know that every kernel will get its own tunnel, its own 24-hour journey, its own double fertilization. You know that in 3 weeks the plant will sit down and count its children and decide, from the tip backward, how many it can afford. You know it will strip its own leaves and hollow out its own stalk to feed them, and that if it falls over in October, it fell over because it chose the grain. And you know that at the end, it will lock every door from the inside, dry itself to the point where nothing can live in it, and stand there holding the whole summer in its hands, waiting for someone to come. That field isn't still. That field is the loudest thing for miles, and it's screaming in a language made of water and sugar and chemistry and time, and it has been having this argument with the sky every summer for 9,000 years, and it will have it again next year whether we notice or not. So the next time you're driving past a cornfield, and you will, they're everywhere, they're so ordinary they're practically wallpaper, I'd ask you to do just one thing. Don't look at the field. Look at one plant. Pick one. Any one. There are 30,000 in that acre and they all look identical, and every single one of them is fighting its own private war, making its own decisions, doing its own arithmetic, and every single one of them will produce, if things go well, one cob with 800 kernels, each of which required its own individual miracle. And every one of those kernels is a summer's worth of sunlight, air, and water, packed into something the size of your fingernail, that has been made patiently, quietly, without any fuss at all, to survive the winter. That's not a crop. That's a plant that figured out how to send a piece of July into the future. And it's been doing it, without asking anyone for anything, since long before there was anyone to ask.